Recording in progress. Welcome back, everybody. If you're just joining us, we're back on break. So the first half, we went through kind of what rendering is, how it relates to us in the CG world, because rendering originally started out as not necessarily a fine art only, but really started out as a way to visualize architecture. I mean, architecture rendering has been around for centuries. People pay for somebody to build something. They want to see what it's going to look like. So who do you get to do that? You get an artist to render out what that building will look like. The stone, the glass, the marble, the wood, whatever materials you're using. Okay, so for our Arnold discussion, let's talk about the Arnold render view, the render settings, and kind of the workflow we're going to use. Now, before we do that, let's talk about the actual exercise that you're going to be doing for us. So here we are. Ooh, wrong one. It's my, there it is. Geez. Okay. All right, so today we're going to be worrying about, not necessarily worrying, but working on rendering. And today's exercise involves two scenes that we've got for you. One is a day scene and one is a nighttime scene. The whole idea is for you to render these out and match at least the quality level that we provide in our reference images. We're going to talk about the tools you're going to use in a second when we actually go in and we start looking at Arnold and how it works inside of Maya. Many of you probably already know about Arnold, but let's talk about what the settings actually do. And if you're just blindly rendering in Arnold, it can be a little confusing because of the way they specify their sampling. All right, so you've got a choice of one out of the 4 daytime images here. Now you'll notice I've got a focal length underneath and a lens size. And that is basically to start to acquaint you guys with how things look in relationship through the eyes of a camera. Anybody in gaming, you're going to be living with that because Unreal has cinematic camera emulation in there. Even for gaming, you'll wind up using that kind of simulation. So when somebody says, I want a long shot, I want a 70 millimeter, you have to understand, just at least a little bit what that means. I wish we had a class in photography because it would really benefit you guys for lighting and how to frame stuff up in a camera. But we don't. So we're just going to try and do the best we can with a little bit of time that we have here to give you guys at least some basics. All right, so you're going to pick one of these. Now, I have a render camera set up already for you. And in that render camera, there are bookmarks. So bookmarks allow you to go to a different location using the same camera, and it will also keep information like the focal length of your camera lens. 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 70, 100, whatever it happens to be. We also, so you're going to choose to do one day scene and then one night scene. Same kind of deal. You only have one camera view or camera angle that is the same between the two. The rest are a little bit different. So Here's a little screenshot of the render cam. And then to use the bookmarks, if you're in the render camera in the viewport, you go to view, go to bookmarks, and you'll see the different camera angles right there. And the camera will fly to that position, and it will also change focal length for you automatically. All right, so we're going to be using this Arnold rendering workflow doc. So I've got little bookmarks here. They're not really bookmarks, they're hyperlinks that will take you to the different sections in it, or you can just kind of scroll down. But what I tried to do was break down all the essential things that you need in Arnold to be able to produce a decent quality render. So one of the things is the render view itself. That's where you actually see your render. So we've got a bunch of tools inside there that we can deal with. We've got the camera we can render with, we can crop, we can do an IPR, which will constantly run until you stop it. And that will allow you to make changes and see what the changes are. If you're doing an IPR and it doesn't look like it's updating, you can refresh it. And it's got display settings. Little gear icon with the display settings is how we add in our, basically it's called a post-imager processor. It allows us to add in their denoiser, which they call noise. So it's actually very simple to use. You add in the imager, the denoiser, you choose it, and it will automatically, when it's done doing its render, it will automatically go through and denoise the scene for you. Now, the thing about denoise is it will not take a crappy render, meaning a really low quality render, and make it beautiful. You need to put, enough samples in where there's enough information for the denoiser to do a good job. And I'll show you some examples of, what happens when you have too little samples. So you can store snapshots inside there. The render settings are super important, mostly for the Arnold part, the Arnold renderer. Like the comment tab, you want to make sure that's set up, but that's usually not as important when you're doing a single frame, because our single frame is going to come right out of Arnold's render view. When you're doing multiple frames, the comment tab is something you're going to need to change for animation. All right, the Arnold tab. So actually, let me pull this up. Let me start up Maya. It's easier to look at inside Arnold and be able to see what's going on. This is where some of the confusion lies in Arnold. Like, what is it doing? I don't know. So when you first start up, of course, you have to wait for, at least for me, I got to wait for everything to start up. Now, in addition to Arnold, I've also got RenderMan loaded in here still. And then Arnold will load in after that. All right, so we're going to be using the Arnold shelf for a lot of stuff. This is where you're going to find your Arnold render view right here, simply by clicking that little eye icon. If you click the button next to it, that will render the frame immediately when you open up the render view. So this one will just open up the Arnold render view. The other one will render immediately. All right, so in the Arnold render view, you got the camera. If you have, right now I have an empty scene, so it's got a single camera inside of it, a perspective camera. Arnold's not real keen on, doing orthographic cameras. So it'll do them for you, but unless you've actually got a scene open with something in it, it's not going to do much. If you want to crop an area, this little button right here will allow you to crop and render inside that area. And that will be the render button. Here is your render. They're kind of like render settings, but they're really more like display settings for the renderer. This is where you add your denoiser in. So you'll notice post is the tab that's highlighted. And this has got to be with Arnold 4.2.1.1. Older versions do not have the display settings or the post tab. So to add an imager, you simply go down and use the denoiser. If you are on a PC, you can use the denoiser optics. That will use the graphics card for your NVIDIA card, if you've got an NVIDIA card, but we've got AMD cards here on the Macs. So we want the denoiser noise. And actually the denoiser noise works PC, NVIDIA, AMD. It doesn't really matter. So you add a denoiser. The options for the denoiser at the bottom, I've got those broken out inside the dock here. So the variance, well, first off, the thing at the top is the patch radius. That increases the softness of the denoising area. It tries to preserve some features. The default is usually pretty good, 3. 9 is the radius. Those are the total areas of pixels being denoised. So they have 9. That's sufficient for most scenes. And the default variance, that's the strength of the denoiser, is at 0.25. All right, so it's a good balance between trying to remove noise and maintain your image without being too blurry. The more you increase it, the blurrier your image is going to get, because it has to smooth out all the noise in your scene. All right, so just kind of a quick rundown here. All right. So the Arnold render settings, this part can be kind of confusing. Under renderer. For today, we're only going to be interested in this section up top here. We're not going to have to worry about ray depth for now or any of the other settings down toward the bottom. And for today, we're really only going to be worrying about these two right here. Camera AA and diffuse. So think of camera AA as being like your minimum number of samples. And down here, the diffuse, think of that as your indirect or bounce light. Now, in this room that we're in here in Full Sail, indirect light is light that is coming from the ceiling where it bounces off the tables, bounces around the room. I've got the projector bouncing off the screen. It goes back into the room. It bounces around, up, down, all over the place, right? So areas over in the corners of the room, that's going to be where indirect light is most visible. Under the tables, anywhere you don't have a direct light source shining on it, those are going to be the areas that are noisiest in your scene because they require bounce lighting and calculation. Bounce lighting is always the most expensive type of light to use anywhere because it requires calculating light as it passes through an entire scene, bounces off a wall, bounces off a table, bounces off a floor. Now, you would think these numbers are pretty straightforward, but oh no, they are not. So what's going on here? We see 3, But yet when you look at the top, it says camera AA samples 9. This number 3 is a square root. Meaning 3 times 3, that's 9. So in reality, you're getting 9 samples in your scene. And down here underneath, it says 2. And you think, well, I'm only getting 2 indirect. No, that's the square root. But here's the thing. So this is 9. Come on, 9. This one square root is 4. So you would think, oh, okay. But everything gets multiplied by the camera AA. So this is like your master. So in reality, we only have 4 diffuse samples, but those 4 diffuse samples are multiplied by the camera AA, which is really 9, giving you 36. And that's how Arnold derives these numbers. Everything is multiplied off of the camera AA, and everything is a square root. Sounds confusing, but here's what you need to know. Camera AA, think of like 2 or 3 being low quality, preview quality. Think of 4 to 6 being kind of medium to medium high quality. 8, think of being high quality. Okay, I've actually got that notated in the section right here. Okay, camera AA square root, it's the number that all other arrays are multiplied by. To be honest, I will usually start with my camera AA at 4 and probably my diffuse at 4 also. Instead of me turning everything up, what I will do is add more diffuse or more indirect bounce samples, because that's going to be the area that's the noisiest, before I add more camera AA samples. Remember, if I increase this to say 4, now, well, let me go 4 and 4. So 4 times 4 is 16, right? 16 times 16 is 256. That's how we get camera AA at 16, diffuse samples at 256. Remember, it's 16 times 16, and, you know, bring up your calculator. 16 times 16 is 256. So what I will do is usually start my process with my camera AA at 4, indirect or diffuse at 4, render it out, see what it looks like. If it still looks pretty noisy in the, and most of the time it will, in the indirect areas, I'll turn up my diffuse to maybe 6, maybe 8. Once I hit 8, I'm not really going to give it too much more. Then I might bump up the camera AA. Maybe I need more samples globally everywhere. So I might crank it up to maybe 6. But if you crank them both up to 8, that's going to be a gigantic render hit. Every time you see more samples, think more time. So let's see, if I go here. So now I've got 16 samples globally, but I turned my diffuse up to 8. That gives me 1024. That's a pretty good hunk of sampling number. Now, if I still globally have a lot more noise, I might crank my AA up to 6. Look, if I crank it up to 6, now my minimum samples are 36, but it also is going to bump up my diffuse. It's going to go up to 2304. So we went from 1024 to 2304. Yeah, 2304. That's a huge jump. That's like 1,000 more samples. So automatically, you want to caution yourself from going like, because I've had students in the past go, I just crank everything up to 8. Well, at 8, you now have 4K, 4,096 diffuse samples. You may only have 64 samples globally, but remember, everything gets multiplied by that 64. So, like I said, start small, work your way up. Camera AA, start at 4. Take your indirect or your diffuse, start at 4, bump that up a little, bump it up again. Once you hit 8, start thinking about maybe cranking up the camera AA. Now, the reason we're only worrying about those 2 items is because we are not dealing with reflectivity or glass at this point. So most of the rendering we're going to do, if not all of it, no, most of it, will be with flat 50% gray objects in your scene, because we're not worried about color, we're not worried about reflectivity or textures on there. Nothing distracts us more than shiny objects, right? So we're all drawn to that first, rather than how is the light falling on that flat surface. If you can make a flat diffuse surface look good, when you add materials, it's going to look great. So this is really the crux of getting a decent render in. If you can render good quality images, getting these first 2, when we get into add materials with it, which is shiny stuff and glass, then just turning up the specular and the transmission will make sense, because you will only see noise in those shiny areas, where all the other areas will look great, but you'll look at a reflection and go, wow, there's a lot of noise in there. How do I fix that? Well, you're going to have to crank up the specular a little bit, because now we got shiny objects. Okay. So, any questions so far? Balin, Josh, Cody, Diamond, any questions? You good? Okay. Anybody have questions out there in the Zoomosphere? Javier's good, no questions. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the first example. So I'm going to, first thing I want to do is, if you haven't done so, you're going to download your project. I've got mine downloaded already. And what I want to do is basically set my project to this folder here, my Maya Project Arnold folder. So File, Set Project, got to navigate to the right place. There's my lesson 1. There's my project SAL Arnold, project 1. There's my Maya project folder. If I open it up, I can see the workspace. I can see all the subfolders. That's the folder I want to select, and then hit the set button. Once I do that, if I go File Open or hit the little folder icon, it should take me into the project folder, into my scenes file or my scenes folder. All right, so I'm going to open up my scene file. It should open up in wireframe and should basically, now, if you get an error message like I got here, don't assume that the file is corrupted. When we originally did this, we had V-Ray installed and we were testing it out. And some of the V-Ray nodes got stuck in the Miocene and won't get out. So if you have this error, caution RenderMan, not the current renderer, don't worry about it. Just click OK. You should be fine. All right, so it opens up into the RenderCam wireframe. For this, you honestly don't need to be in shaded mode, although you can go to shaded mode if you want to. Shaded mode, yeah. There's really no point. So here is my RenderCam. You can always check it, go to panels, perspective, there's the RenderCam. If you want to change views, you go to the view menu in the viewport, go to bookmarks, and choose one of the other camera views. By default, your scene should open up to shot 1, 16mm. So if you want to go shot 2, there's shot 2. You can go shot 3, which is an overhead, and you can go to shot 4, which is 70mm, which is kind of I got the camera as far away as I could get it from the subject, and a 70mm or basically a long lens, telephoto lens, will kind of zoom in on the subject. All right, so I'm just going to go back to the initial setup just to kind of show you what to expect when you start working on this. Now, in addition to getting that Maya project folder, you will also get a folder with reference images in it, which means these are your target for trying to get the scene to look as clean as you can, noise-free, and have the quality still be pretty good. So each one of the camera views has a reference image for you. There's the nighttime scene. The center folder contains a Photoshop template. So when you're done rendering, what you will do is open up the Photoshop template, copy your image, you'll open up your render and the template both in Photoshop. You copy the image or the render in Photoshop and you paste it into the layer that's in the template. Now, let me kind of make this a little narrower so we can see everything here. All right, so there are layers here. So all of the daytime render reference images are in here. You just have to turn off the layer you don't want. So for example, if you did the overhead, you'll have to turn off a couple of these to get to this one. If you decided to do the last one, you have to turn that one on. So they're all on by default. You just turn off the ones you don't want to be displayed. Now, it doesn't matter if you accidentally leave the ones on underneath because it's not going to be visible, so it doesn't really matter. Now, in addition to popping your render in here, you're going to change the watermark on there and just go in with the text tool, highlight it, last name underscore first name, year, month. Now, down here at the bottom, you're going to keep track of the camera AA samples you used, and that you can put in the square root number. It doesn't have to be the final square root sum. The diffuse samples, the denoiser variance if you changed it. If not, put in 0.25 and the time it took to render. The whole idea behind this is figure out what the quality level is. Those are your samples. And what time did it take to do that? It's time versus quality, always. That's our battle. So same thing with the night. We have a separate nighttime template. All right, so let me cancel this, quit out of Photoshop for now. Just a word of advice, Photoshop and Maya don't play well together. They're both memory hogs. If you're trying to render and you've got Maya open, or you're trying to stream a movie or a game or something else, it's going to kill your render time and your laptop battery. So a couple of words of wisdom: always plug your computer in when you're rendering, because you will drain your battery quickly. All right, now, so we got all that sort of figured out. Let's go back to Maya. Here we go. And let's figure out, let's do a render. So I'm going to open up my render settings. It should have the default Arnold settings. It does. And to start with, I'm just going to use the default setting. It's always a good idea because it'll render really quick. You'll be able to see. Make sure, first of all, if your project is set properly. If your project is not set properly and you hit the render button, you may be missing the image outside the window. So give it a couple seconds to start up. And there we go. So you can see with the default settings, I mean, it renders pretty quickly, but it's going to render, well, low quality. Let's be honest. So you can see all that grain, that is noise, meaning it has not converged with the camera has not converged with the light to get a really good quality. All right, so let me stop the IPR and let's talk about this image. Now, I want you to take note in this image, this area right here, this area right here. Compare those two areas to the rest of the scene. Notice there is much less noise inside here and in here than there is in the rest of the scene. Okay, this is direct light, meaning a light source is hitting that surface directly, and consequently, the camera can see it really quickly. So light doesn't have to bounce around in order to get to it. So this is direct light here too. Everything else, here, 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 okay, this is all indirect. Notice how much noisier that area is. So when we talk about cleaning up noise, those are the areas we need to worry about. Like I said, direct light will clean up much quicker than indirect or bounce light. Indirect or bounce light is our diffuse. All right, let me clear that. Let's go to our render settings. So here's my diffuse. Now, having done this initial render, here's the workflow I want you guys to try. Having done this initial render, if I make a change here, the common thought would be, oh, let's just render it again. Well, okay, I know what it looks like totally. What I want to do is I want to kind of zoom in on areas that I know are noisy and are going to take the most to clean up. And they're going to be these areas right here. So I really don't need to render the entire scene. What I'm going to do is use this little button right here. This is a render an area that I create. So I click on it, left click, drag my mouse, and I'm going to render this small area here. So now it takes less time, but I can go in and I can go, all right, well, let me see what this looks like if I turn this up to 4. So now I added a bunch more samples in there. So looks like it did a better job. But what I want to do is, let me save an image here. And I can compare. So let me turn up my diffuse to 4. So now the indirect area is going to get 256 rather than 64 samples. It's going to take longer to render, but the quality should be better. So let's compare that to the previous. You should be able to see a kind of a big difference there. So this is the process, right? So I got them at 4 and 4. All right, well, let me save this image, and you can do that by clicking the little snapshot button down in the bottom right. So let me try and go to, well, let's take diffuse to 6. So now that bumps it up from 256 to 576. So that's almost twice as many samples as the previous version. Again, it's going to take a little bit longer. Okay, one word of warning. When we are rendering, we're going to reach a point of diminishing returns, which means we're going to be cranking up samples, but we're not going to see it get twice as good every time we render, which is what's going to happen here. Like, that's not twice as good as the previous render. So here's my initial one, right? You can see that's not quite twice as good, but it's pretty good. And now here's my new one. It's a little better, but not hugely better. So now I'm like, all right, well, let's do this. Let's save that snapshot. Let's go here. Let's render that out. Now, you want to render this out and try to get it to a minimum level of noise before you add in your denoiser. And I'll show you why in a second. Nice thing about the denoiser is it will denoise a small area for you, so you don't have to do the entire scene, which is really helpful. All right, so here we go. Keep going. It's going to take a little longer because now we've got 1024 samples for indirect. So it's creeping, it's creeping, it's creeping. There we go. So let me stop that. Let's compare them. So there we go. There's 64, 256. Was it 576 and now 1024. So you can see 1024 did a good job on the floor, and it did a better job on the table, that desk, but not like a super great job. So now you want to say to yourself, okay, well, what is the threshold before I start adding my denoiser? Well, let's open up the reference images that we provide. Now, one thing that really helps a lot when you're working in Arnold is to load your reference images in. They'll load them in as a snapshot for you, and you can compare the reference with your render to find out how close you are to the quality level you want. So to load your reference in, we go to File, we go Open Image. All right, So we go into that little package we gave you. There's the reference image. That's the one I'm choosing. So let's load it in. All right, so, okay. This is an image that's been completely rendered out and denoised. All right, so let me see what my denoiser looks like when I add it in with the level of quality I have now. So to do that, open up display settings, add imager, denoiser noise. Default settings are usually pretty good. And I'm just going to render out that small area. Again, now what's going to happen is it's going to render it just like it did before, but at the end, it's going to go through and apply that denoise filter, and it should remove the remaining noise that you see inside here. How would that work in the industry then? If you need a reference for how denoised the render should be, what exactly would you want to look at? Well, good question, Isaiah. In the industry, your target's probably going to be reference that you've got. You're always going to have reference. And your reference is probably, for the most part, going to be either a photo or some kind of, I would say, illustrated concept art. And the goal is to try and get it as clean and as noise-free as possible. And what we're trying to show you guys is, using the tools that we have, what kind of level do you need to go for? So right now I have my samples, my camera AA at 4. I've got my diffuse at 8. I've run my denoise filter. So now, how does that compare to the reference? I've run my denoiser inside this small area. Compare it to here. So it took out quite a bit of noise. Now, to be sure, what you can do is you can go and crop another small area, compare that to your reference. If they both look good, then what you might try to do is just render out the entire scene. Does that make sense? So now, to stop cropping that area, let me save that cropped image there. To stop, just turn off the crop, and now it will automatically render the entire scene. So let me pick another area, but what I'm going to do is knock my samples down to the default. The reason I'm knocking them down to the default is I want to show you what happens if you try to denoise a scene with really super low samples. Now, the nice thing is you can turn off the denoiser simply by, should be able to right click on it. There it is. No, what did you do? Did we crash? We did. All right, so there you go. Maya crashed. Happy day. So what did we learn? Well, I should have saved my scene for one thing, which I didn't. And always, 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 don't do like your instructor did. Open the scene, do a save as. Get a working copy. Don't work on the original, because if Maya crashes, it could corrupt the original file. Now, in your case, you just go download a new one. But if you're working for somebody and you say to them, oh, can I get another copy of that scene? It got corrupted. It's like, what? What happened? What did you do? That's a very uncomfortable conversation to have with somebody, because they think you've personally destroyed their work, when in reality, it's digital and we just got corrupted. So we learned to never trust Maya. Remember, Maya hates humans. Maya hates everybody equally. Maya is like the bender of software, if anybody's familiar with Futurama. Kill all humans is Maya's basic premise. So let's wait for everything to start up. And I'm going to, there we go. I'm going to set my project. Why? Because don't think that Maya remembered to save your project folder or your location. So first thing I want to do, set project. I got to find project 1. There we are, right here. That's my project folder. Let's set project. Let's go to the Arnold shelf, open. All right, so fortunately, if Maya does crash at this point, you get to set everything up. You kind of know where you were. Hopefully you remember. If not, write it down. Don't worry about the error message. And let's do a save as. Why? Because then you won't have to start over again, like I'm doing. Like I said, learn from others' mistakes, especially mine. That's what happens. You do demos all the time. It's like, yeah, what could possibly happen? Of course, Maya can happen. It can crash. So yeah, save your stuff. All right. So now I got a working copy. Let's open up the render settings. I want to load my reference in. How do I do that? Well, file, open image. Let's load that first reference image in. I believe that is it. Yep, that's what we were working on. It loads down there. Let's open up our render settings. Got default settings. Great. This is actually what I was going to reset to. And save. Why? Because it's Maya. Let's do a quick render with default settings. All right, so we already talked about the areas that have direct light are the cleanest. The areas that don't have direct light are the indirect. Indirect is the diffuse settings inside the render settings in Arnold. Camera AA, global settings. All right. So what I'm going to do here at this point, stop. This is going to be my reference. Reference, I mean, this is my baseline bottom preview quality set of samples. So I'm going to crop out, let's go to the same area I had before. I like that area because it's got lots of noise. So I've already got an idea of what that area looks like. Let's see what happens if I try to denoise this area. There's my denoiser. I've added it in. What am I going to do? Save, because Maya's got me paranoid now. And let's render out that small area. All right, so it rendered and denoised. And let's compare that with my previous. So you might say to yourself, wow, it did a pretty good job, even with really, really low samples. But here's the thing, take a look at the floor. It's all splotchy. Compare that with the actual render. Now that splotchiness is caused by not enough samples for the denoiser to be able to filter out accurately. And what it's doing is you're getting big gaps in the information, and it's it just looks really nasty. So that's what happens when you've got, and take a look, the detail on the sides here is much, much softer right here. It's even still got a bit of noise in here that it can't get out. So let's save that. So let's turn it up to, let's do our 4 and 4 and see what it does with the denoiser here. So now 4 and 4 means we got 16 samples for our min. We got 256 for the indirect. How's the denoiser going to handle that? All right, so give it a second, give it a couple seconds. There we go. It denoised it. So let's compare it. It did a better job, but it's still got a lot of splotch in it. Right around there. We're getting closer. All right, so save some time. Let me go up to 8. So now I got 16, 1024. Let's render that again, that little area. So I could have gone up to 6. That would give me 576. We already kind of determined that was still a little noisier than we wanted. So that's why I'm going to go camera AA at 4, diffuse at 8, see what we get. Now, the ideal situation is work on this, do a couple small areas of your scene, make sure they're nice and clean, they look good compared to the reference before you render out the entire thing. Come on, render, 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 render. There we go. Rendering out, and then once it gets to 100, it'll start to denoise, which is actually pretty quick. All right, so here's my denoise with my diffuse at 4, and there it is at 8. You can see I got a little bit of splotchiness on the floor, on the amp, on the bed. Got a little more detail here. You can see that shadow here, right on the bottom of the table. Comes out a little bit more detail. It's a lot more of an accurate looking shadow also. All right, so when you're happy with this, turn off the crop, render out the entire scene, and then what do? Well, I'm going to pretend that I've rendered out my entire scene. So I'm going to go to File, Save Multi-Layer EXR. Now, it should take it and try to put it in your images folder for your project, which is great. So now you name it. Give it a temporary name because you're going to put this into a template and then rename the template correctly. So just make it a good working name that you understand. So I'm going to call this day 01, 2021-05. And then it will automatically put in the .exr for you because you've saved it as a multi-layer EXR. So I hit save. Should be done. It's all voodoo. So now, in theory, in my Maya project folder, in images, there is my scene. Now, if you double click on it, it may not open. Like for some reason, RenderMan thinks that it wants to launch the RenderMan license app. So just right click. You can open it with Photoshop, open it with Preview, either one, but you're going to be putting it into a template. So you may as well open it in Photoshop. When you open an EXR in Photoshop, always save your EXR, or I'm sorry, open it with your alpha channel data as alpha. There we go. So now you can see, obviously, I did not denoise the whole scene, but the area that I did denoise works pretty well. So now at this point, what I want to do is open up the template. And let's find the right template. Here we go, daytime. So that's the scene I want to use. Nope, come back here. Javier says, how do I get the post tab? Javier, if you're in Maya, you're in your Arnold render view, you go into the display settings and the post tab should be there. Remember, you need to have Arnold 4.2.1.1 at least in order to have that post tab. It will not display in any older versions. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. Let me get my water out here. I forgot to break it out. There it is. Get a quick drink. Okay. Yeah. Cody had to update his. So you didn't have any problems updating, did you, Cody? Good. All right. So he had no issues. So if you need to update, that's, probably the best thing to do. All right. So we are in Photoshop. Now I want to get my EXR render into my template. I'm going to select all, Command A, copy, Command C. I want to be inside the right. I'm going to go and put it in my reference images because I want it to be in the same group as all of my reference images so I can basically position it. I paste, use the move tool, and you might want to zoom in to make sure that there are no kind of borders and it's not jinky. I do have snaps to guide set up in Photoshop, but sometimes you need to zoom in order to be able to use them accurately. So then you fill in the watermark. Oh, camera AA, I used 4, diffuse, I used 8, variance, I used the default 0.25. And then what was my render time? Well, you can get your render time in Arnold. So let's go to Maya. If I open up the Arnold tab, there's my render time down here. Now, average render time using render settings, like I had, we're probably going to be between, I'd say 8-10 minutes, maybe. If your render is taking 30 minutes, you need to seriously check your render settings. That's why I say do small chunks, render it out, turn on the denoise filter or the denoiser, and see if you're getting that quality level. Look for splotchiness, look for softening, look for edge quality that's not the same as the reference. And then once you render it out, obviously I only rendered a teeny tiny piece. So I rendered probably 1/8 of that. So my render time would probably, if I multiply it, be about close to 10 minutes for me. I'm streaming, I'm recording, I'm doing a lot of stuff. So my little Mac is maxed out. Haha, pun intended. All right, and then what you do, you save as in Photoshop. Once you have all your information, we save it as a Targa file format. Why? Because Targa is less lossy than JPEG or PNG or even TIFFs. It's not lossless, but it compresses it at a much lower rate than any of the others. It used to be the, believe it or not, file format of choice for compositing, for making a movie, until EXRs came along. So it's an older format, but very stable. Targa template, give it the proper name, you save it out. Targa options, 24-bit, because we're not worried about alpha channels. We're only worried about RGB information. Click OK. And now we should be set to go. Do I want to save it? No, don't save. All right, so the rest of the workflow doc has some good information also. And it's basically a lot of the information I just went over in Maya, in the Arnold render view, EPR, IPR live sessions. Rendering sequences, we're going to get to that in project 4. That's basically animation. A lot of programs call it batch rendering, but Arnold's batch renderer comes with a watermark unless you purchase the commercial rendering version of Arnold, which is $600. We're not doing that. And there's no need to. You can use, it's an older technique, but Arnold recommends it. If you're not buying the commercial version, you render out of Maya's render view using Arnold, and it's called a render sequence. It works, it's free, and it does a decent job. So if you do chunks, does it take time away from the final render since small pieces of it are already rendered? When you turn off that crop area, it's going to automatically re-render the entire thing. So it's going to start from scratch, which is basically what you want to do. So what we're doing is rendering in small chunks just to make sure everything is set up, Miles. And then, yes, we're rendering everything at once. So if we have time, can you run through how to update Arnold? So yeah, there's the link that Cody used. Link to Arnold updates. That should get you there, Javier. And I did explain this a little bit earlier. I don't know if you were here, but if you need to update Maya, you need to go to Autodesk, log in with your account. You go up to your account and manage products. And once you're in the manage products, you go to updates, and you should be able to find updates for Maya, and that new version of Maya should include the new version of Arnold also. All right, so we got a little bit of time left before we have to kind of vacate the room. What I want to do is go over basically camera lenses, since you guys are going to be doing a little exploratory portion called MyComp for project 1. Now, the MyComp portion, let me pull up here. So MyComp allows you to take one of our scenes, use it as a foundation, and what you will do is basically find photo reference of a scene that you would like to try and recreate the look and feel of. We're not asking you to remodel anything. We're only asking you to use our props as a staging element to frame it up, make a composition that's similar to what your reference is, using our lights. It's not a lighting exercise. It's not a modeling exercise. It's a layout exercise. So you're going to use our geometry, use our scenes, use the camera angle, or no, you're going to make your own camera angle, but you would use the same camera size, being HD 540, which is 960 wide, 540 high. So all that information is here, but let me give you a quick example of what other classes have done, so you can get an idea of what this MyComp entails. All right, so you can take the geometry, rearrange it any way you want, group it together. The idea is look and feel. You're not going to get the same camera angle. Sometimes you're not going to get the same geometry look, but you can mimic it as close as you can. So got a computer. The nighttime scene has, artificial lights in it, not like the daytime scene, which is meant to look like, natural lighting from the outside. So Toy Story is always a favorite to do. Overhead shot, just trying to match the camera angle and put the compositional elements in the same place. We don't have Buzz, we don't have Woody, but you take a couple of small pieces of our geometry and piece it together. No modeling, scale, rotate, move, translate, whatever you want to do, duplicate if you have to, but no modeling, no changing lights. It really limits you, but you can be really creative if you let yourself go. So a simple scene. Obviously, bedroom, that works well. Got reference of a bedroom. This one I kind of like because it kind of captured that vanishing point, which is really cool. Close up of the floor. The floor almost looks like the road and the tracks that are laid out in the reference. This one would have been a little better had they made their little box, car a little more to the side. You want to try and position your subject more or less in the same part of the frame, same scale in the frame, and the same viewing angle. All right, something simple, camera under the bed, couple of, those are soda bottles, extended to make it look like feet, but capture the look and feel. Took the floor, duplicated it, put it sideways, took a couple of boxes, stacked them on top of each other to make it look like stairs. There's a doorway in there. There's a light in the ceiling, so they happen to get all the elements lined up. Whole bunch of different elements meant to look like the train. All those weights that are in there, just stuff scaled. So you can do a lot of work, you can do a little work. It's all about getting the look and feel. It's not, be as clever as you want, have fun with it, but don't stress out about it. Find something simpler if your first reference is too complicated. It's really about trying to be as creative as you can with the limited resources you have. Because honestly, in a production, the layout phase, you'll be using primitives anyway, and you're just dropping them in there to kind of get the look and feel of what the framing of the shot's going to be. And that's kind of why we talk a little bit about cameras. So camera lenses can either focus light or disperse light. Camera lenses are broken up into 4 categories. We've got a fisheye lens, which is 2.5 to 15 millimeters, and that's the distance from the camera sensor to the back of the lens itself. And they're all measured in millimeters. Now, a fisheye lens, as the name implies, has a curved piece of glass on the top, just like the eye of a fish, or our eye, as a matter of fact. So I like to compare it to looking through the peephole of a door, right? Most of those little peepholes of a door are actually fisheye lenses meant to show you about 180 degrees of what's on the other side of the door. Now, a step up, I would say, from that. Oh, and you'll notice that it has what's called barrel distortion, where the curvature of that lens causes anything flat to normally curve in the same direction of the lens. So the next one is a wide angle. That's between 15 millimeter and 45 millimeters. Now, 45 millimeters is pretty big. All of Maya's standard cameras, when you create a camera from Maya or open a brand new scene, are all 35 millimeter lenses. Anything in Maya. So for example, where are you? Come back, Maya. So let me open up a brand new scene. Let me save this one, open up a new scene. All right, so I open up a new scene. I go to my perspective camera, go into the attributes of it, focal length 35 millimeters. Every single one of these ortho cameras is also 35 millimeters. Maya automatically gives that to you. So if you're working trying to match a production and they give you a lens, you plug that lens into the camera's attributes to the focal length. So a wide angle lens doesn't shrink the image as much as a fisheye lens. We still get some distortion, but generally not enough. So the one on the left, this friend of mine shot these. He did a lot of, trickery. This is a whole bunch of multiple images. This is a 24 millimeter camera. So you can see the hand looks gigantic, like it's coming toward the camera. But it's not quite the same as a typical like realtor's photo, like you look at your apartment online. Gee, it looks really big, and you get there and it looks like a shoebox. Well, that's because they're using a wide angle lens. It looks really great. So the one on the right looks kind of scary, looks a little horror-y. That's a 16 millimeter lens. It's like right at the cusp almost of a fisheye lens. So we still have some of that distortion where things look elongated the closer they get to the camera lens. If you are doing a portrait, you will most likely always use a normal lens. A portrait lens is usually a 50 millimeter lens. Most photographers, you go someplace to get it professionally done, they'll have what are called fixed lenses. It means you can't dial in or focus. You can focus, but you cannot zoom in or zoom out. It's set at one focal length. So that's going to be 50 millimeters. And that does not distort, it doesn't magnify or shrink the image. Now, sporting events require the photographer to usually be way far away from where the action is. So they use what are called telephoto lenses. Telephoto lens is basically allowing the photographer to magnify an area far, far away. And what happens when you magnify something far away is you get what's called lens compression. Because we have a foreground, midground, and background far away, we bring that forward and it squeezes all those planes together. So what happens is we get the ability to kind of not be able to judge how far apart objects are. So here, these buildings in a city, right? You don't know whether they're attached, whether there's like an alleyway in between them or a road, could be 1-lane highway, 2-lane highway, 4-lane highway. We don't know because it's compressed. Same thing here with these players. They overlap on top of each other, but we can't really judge how far apart they are. So the reason I bring this up is you may find some of these features in your reference images that you try to find for the MyComp exercise. And just know it's probably going to be one of these elements that are going on here. So, as I mentioned, you create a camera And what you can do simply is go up to Create, Cameras, Camera. You can change your focal length here. If you want to look through your camera, you go Panels, look through Selected. After you select it, zoom out, because right now I'm inside that sphere. So now I'm looking at it with a 35mm lens. You also want to turn on what is called resolution gate, which will basically show you what the image size that's set up in your render settings. And the default is HD 540. And it will provide a little bit of an area that's grayed out so that anything inside this area is not, well, is definitely going to render. Anything outside of it will not. So if I change the focal length, if I go to 24, you can see it makes it look like that image is far away when I really haven't moved the camera. So as I go into the fisheye area, you can see it starts to distort when I zoom in. So 35, 50, 50, 70. So 24, 35, 50, 70, 100, 200, 300. Those are common camera lenses that photographers will use. So for, fisheye, it'll be something like maybe 9mm. Could be 8, but usually something like 9. It's going to create a lot of distortion. Turn on that resolution gate. You really don't have to worry about the action or the safe titling since we're not doing animation. But this should get you an idea of, if I look at an image, it looks distorted. Why does it look distorted? Especially reference image. What do I need to do? I got all my elements in there. It's framed up perfectly, but I'm getting that distortion. That might be the focal length of the actual camera. All right, so I know tons of information. Cody says, so the reference image is just a random image we find, yes, of an environment or something you would like to try to recreate. Make sure it's doable. But yes, and it does need to be a photo image instead of concept art or, somebody else's CG. Just make sure it's a photo. That way you're getting an actual camera lens and you're getting somebody, in theory, who knows what they're doing? Question mark. All right. Lots of information, like I said. Any questions? Everybody good in here? Everybody good? Okay. How about out there in the Zoomosphere? Any questions? Like I said, a lot of information. That's kind of why we record the lectures, in case you need to go back, go through the stuff. And day one's always kind of hard because we got a lot to cram in, and we always run pretty close to over, and we got another class coming in, so won't be too bad. Come back to lab at, let's see, yeah. We'll go lunch 12:45. Come back to lab at 1:45. We'll start up lab then. I might be a little late because I got to go home and render this out, upload it, eat lunch, and then I'll see you guys in lab. Frank, you good? You got any questions or anything? All right, so Frank will be running lab for you guys. So have a good lunch. I'll see you guys about 1:45. Come back to virtual lab. And see you guys on Wednesday. We'll still have live campus lecture on Wednesdays, or Mondays and Wednesdays, and Fridays all virtual.